Why did the cup tremble in her hands when the bass was finally quiet? She told herself it was the cold, that the mountain air always did this, even in late summer. But the truth pressed heavier than the metal cup itself. Sarah Mitchell stood just outside the aid station, watching dust settle where helicopters had lifted off hours earlier. The day had been ordinary in the way war sometimes pretended to be. Routine checks, a sprained ankle, a half-joking argument about whose turn it was to restock bandages. The kind of calm that made you forget, just briefly, how fast everything could unravel. She was 22. Too young, some said, to carry this much responsibility. Too young to decide who lived and who didn't. But she had learned early that age didn't matter when blood was leaving a body faster than hope. She hadn't joined to be brave. She joined to be useful. Her parents had taught her that, quietly, through long dinners filled with hospital stories and silences that meant more than words. She learned how hands could be steady even when hearts weren't. How fear didn't disqualify you from doing the right thing, it just meant you did it anyway. Inside the aid station, fluorescent lights hummed like they always did. Captain Rivera reviewed charts. Henderson checked equipment with the reverence of a ritual. Sarah went through her bag again. Tourniquets, gauze, seals, each item a promise. Each one a reminder that someday, maybe today, it would all matter. The radio crackled. Nothing urgent. Yet, she stepped back outside as the sun slid lower behind the mountains. The sky burned gold, then purple, beautiful, indifferent. Somewhere out there, unseen eyes watched. They always did. Sarah thought of the young private she'd treated last week. Danny, 19, too eager, too polite, the kind of kid who still waved at medics like they were invincible. She waved back earlier. She wouldn't forget that. The first explosion didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like the ground tearing open. She was already moving before the siren finished screaming. Training took over, bodies dropped, shouts filled the air. Rockets slammed into the perimeter with surgical cruelty. The base shook. Dust swallowed the horizon. Sarah sprinted toward the aid station, heart hammering but hands steady. Inside, everything changed at once. Mass casualty protocol, litter stretchers, blood on concrete that hadn't been there seconds before. Rivera's voice cut through the chaos, calm, clipped, deadly serious. Go where they fall. Sarah didn't hesitate. She grabbed her bag and ran back into hell. The staging area was burning. Metal twisted, smoke choked. Men yelled names that wouldn't be answered. She dropped beside the first wounded soldier she saw, hands already working, voice calm even as the world detonated around them. She didn't notice her own fear until later. In the moment there was only bleeding, pressure, breath. She stabilized one, then another. And then she saw Danny. He was too still. The world narrowed to the space between her hands and his torn uniform. Blood pulsed where it shouldn't. Seconds mattered now, not minutes. She worked fast, tourniquet, pressure, packing the wound deeper than felt reasonable. Her hands disappeared into red, his breathing hitched, her jaw clenched. Stay with me, she whispered, more to herself than him. She leaned over him, shielding him from debris, from bullets, from whatever came next. That was when she sensed it, before she saw them. Movement close, too close. 3 figures emerged from smoke like ghosts with intent. Her rifle was useless on her back. Both hands were busy keeping a teenager alive. She didn't think. She chose. The men spoke in a language she didn't understand, but the meaning was clear enough. Step away. Save yourself. Sarah shook her head once. Her hands never left the wound. The first blade hit between her shoulders. Cold. Then fire. Her breath caught, but she didn't scream. The second strike followed, then another. Pain exploded, sharp, blinding, consuming, but beneath it was something stronger. Purpose. Obligation. A line she would not cross. She stayed. Blood soaked her uniform, her vision tunneled. Her lungs burned, still her hands pressed down. Still Danny lived. 7 times they stabbed her. 7 times she refused to let go. When they finally left, they didn't look back. When help arrived, her hands were locked in place. "She won't let go," someone said, voice breaking. Even unconscious, her body remembered the mission. Sarah disappeared into darkness, not knowing if she would ever wake again. And when she did, the ceiling was white, the silence too clean. She tried to move. Nothing happened. Panic rose, sharp and immediate. She tried again, nothing. The doctor's words came gently, carefully, as if softness could blunt their weight. "Permanent. Paralyzed. Below the waist." Her world collapsed inward. Every plan she'd ever made required legs that would never answer again. She cried until exhaustion claimed her. Then she cried some more. But when they told her Danny had survived, something shifted, just a little, a fragile thread in the dark. She held on to it. Rehabilitation was brutal, humbling, learning how to exist in pieces. Some days she felt proud, others broken beyond words. Visitors came, praise came, it all felt distant. Until the Marines showed up. She hadn't known, no warning, no ceremony. Just lines of dress blues forming a silent corridor. She stopped breathing. They stood for her. For what she had done. For what it had cost. As she rolled through them, salutes rose and held, one after another, respect without spectacle, honor without noise. She cried openly. Not from pain. From being seen. Later medals came, speeches, applause, the president's voice reading words she barely recognized as her own story. She wore the medal, heavy against her chest. But the real weight was quieter. It was Danny walking. It was hands that still worked. It was a life rebuilt, not restored. Years later, when she spoke to young medics, she never told them to be heroes. She told them to understand themselves, to know the cost of their values, to choose in ways they could live with. Sometimes dignity doesn't shout. Sometimes courage doesn't stand tall. Sometimes honor is measured not by what you gain, but by what you refuse to abandon. And sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is stay. Why did the silence after she woke feel louder than the explosion she remembered? Sarah stared at the ceiling for a long time before she understood that the noise in her head wasn't ringing, it was absence. No sirens, no shouted coordinates, no boots running past her ear, just a slow, rhythmic beep that felt too measured to belong to a battlefield. Her mouth was dry, her throat burned. Something tugged uncomfortably at her chest every time she tried to breathe deeper than a shallow sip of air. Panic rose fast, sharp as instinct, until a voice cut through it, calm, practiced, human. "Izzy, you're safe." Safe, the word didn't make sense yet. Her eyes shifted, blurry at first, then clearer. White walls, machines, tubes, a nurse leaning close enough that Sarah could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes. Experience lived there, the kind that knew when not to lie. Sarah tried to move. Her arms responded sluggishly, heavy like they belonged to someone else. She tried her legs. Nothing. She waited, willed them, demanded them. Still nothing. Her heart rate spiked. The machine betrayed her immediately, beeping faster, louder, as if announcing her fear to the room. She tried to speak, but the tube in her throat turned the effort into panic. Hands pressed gently on her shoulders, not restraining, grounding. "Blink once if you understand me," a man said. She blinked. "Twice if you're in pain." She blinked twice, then once more, unable to stop herself. They worked quickly, efficiently, like people who lived in moments like this. Someone explained where she was, somewhere safe, somewhere far from the mountains. Words floated past her: surgery, blood loss, days, but none of them anchored until one sentence landed and refused to move. "You have a spinal injury." Sarah stared at him. She wanted to shake her head, to laugh, to argue with anatomy like it was a bad diagnosis she could correct. "Permanent." The word wasn't cruel, it was precise. When the breathing tube finally came out, she gasped like she'd been underwater too long. Tears followed without permission. Not dramatic, not loud, just relentless. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask how bad. She already knew. Her body told her everything she needed to know. Below her waist, the world was gone. Grief arrived in waves, not all at once. First shock, then anger, sharp, bitter, useless, then bargaining with no one in particular. She would have traded medals, praise, years off her life if someone had offered to rewind 10 minutes on that battlefield. But no one did. When they told her Danny was alive, she closed her eyes and let that truth sit beside the devastation. It didn't erase it. It didn't soften it. But it mattered. Recovery was not heroic. It was humiliating. Learning how to sit without falling, how to move without legs, how to accept help without hating yourself for needing it. Every task that had once been automatic now required planning, patience, and a quiet swallowing of pride. Some days she was determined. She attacked therapy like it was another mission: measurable goals, visible progress. Other days she stared at the wall and wondered who she was if she couldn't run, couldn't kneel, couldn't carry. Visitors came and went: officers, medics, people who spoke carefully as if the wrong word might shatter her. She appreciated their kindness and resented it in equal measure. Captain Rivera came often. He never talked down to her, never softened the truth. "You did everything right," he told her once, standing near the window where afternoon light spilled in. "You didn't fail. The situation did." She nodded, but the words slid off. Right didn't feel like enough. When the transfer orders came stateside, she felt relief and loss collide. Afghanistan had taken something from her, but it had also been where she had known exactly who she was. The flight home was long, quiet, filled with other wounded bodies wrapped in blankets and silence. Sarah watched clouds pass beneath the aircraft and wondered how many of them were carrying stories that would never fully be told. Walter Reed was bigger, brighter, less forgiving. Here, there was no hiding from the future. Therapists pushed her hard, not cruelly, purposefully. They knew that pity helped no one. They taught her how to transfer, how to balance, how to exist in a body that no longer obeyed instinct. Some nights she lay awake, replaying the moment over and over. The choice, the knife, the weight of Danny's blood on her hands. Would she do it again? The answer scared her with how immediate it was. Yes. That truth came with pride and grief, tangled so tightly she couldn't separate them. When Danny finally came to see her, she almost asked him not to. Almost. She didn't know if she could handle the gratitude in his eyes. But when he walked in, walking, everything else faded. He stopped a few feet away, like he wasn't sure he deserved to be closer. "I'm alive because of you," he said, voice shaking. Sarah looked at his legs, then at his face. "Good," she said quietly, "then it was worth it." He cried. She didn't stop him. The nomination came later. Words like extraordinary and above and beyond filled rooms she didn't feel connected to. She signed papers, answered questions, relived details she wished she could forget. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a medic who had finished a job and paid the bill in full. The day the Marine stood outside the hospital, she thought she was hallucinating. Rows of dress blues, stillness, precision. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. As she rolled between them, salutes rose in perfect sequence. Respect made visible, gratitude without performance. Her throat closed. Tears came fast and unapologetic. This wasn't about rank or branch. It was about one truth warriors understood instinctively. She had not let one of theirs die alone. Later, when the medal was placed around her neck, cameras flashed. Applause echoed. The weight of the ribbon pressed gently against her collarbones. She smiled because it was expected. But that night alone, she held the medal in her hands and felt the absence of her legs more acutely than ever. No medal could change that. What it could do, she realized slowly, was give shape to the pain, meaning to the loss, context to the sacrifice. She wasn't broken because she failed. She was changed because she chose. And that distinction mattered. In the months that followed, she learned how to live again. Not the same way, not the way she had planned. But honestly, some days she felt strong, others unbearably fragile. Yet every morning she woke up knowing one thing for certain. When the moment came, when it mattered most, she had not turned away. And sometimes, that knowledge is the only thing strong enough to carry you forward when everything else has been taken away. Why did the applause feel heavier than the wheelchair beneath her? Sarah noticed it the first time she rolled into a room full of strangers who already knew her name. They stood too quickly, smiled too carefully. Their eyes didn't look at her face first, they dropped, just for a fraction of a second, to the chair. Then they corrected themselves, always too late. She hated that moment. It made her feel like the injury arrived before she did. Rehabilitation settled into a rhythm that felt nothing like routine. Days were measured in repetitions instead of miles, strength instead of speed, transfer drills instead of sprints. Progress came in inches and bruises, not applause. Her arms grew stronger. Her shoulders burned constantly. The skin of her palms hardened in ways she never expected. Wheelchair gloves replaced combat gloves, and she learned quickly that friction could hurt just as much as shrapnel. What no one warned her about was the quiet. The nights were the worst, when therapy ended, when visitors left, when the machines didn't beep anymore. That was when the memories slipped in uninvited. The knife, the pressure, the moment she realized her body was failing faster than her resolve. Sometimes she woke up convinced her legs were still there, still waiting. Other nights she woke already grieving. Counseling helped, not because it erased anything it didn't, but because it gave her language for what she was feeling. Survivor's guilt, moral injury, identity fracture. Words didn't fix the damage, but they stopped it from spreading. When the official notification arrived, the ceremony, the timeline, the confirmation, she read it twice before setting it down. Medal of Honor. The words felt unreal, like they belonged to someone else's file. She wondered how many people would hear the citation and imagine something cinematic. Gunfire, slow motion, music swelling. They would never imagine blood pooling under her knees. The taste of iron. The way her hands cramped so badly they had to be pried open. They would never imagine the fear, not of dying, but of letting go. She didn't correct them. She let the story exist in whatever shape people needed it to. The Marines' corridor stayed with her more than anything else, more than the medal, more than the headlines. That moment had been pure. No speeches, no cameras, just recognition. She replayed it often during the harder days. When she struggled with independence. When frustration boiled over. When she snapped at nurses who didn't deserve it. That memory reminded her she hadn't been reduced. She had been witnessed. After discharge, civilian life hit her harder than she expected. There were no schedules handed down, no structure unless she built it herself. Grocery stores became obstacle courses. Sidewalks revealed how invisible accessibility really was. People meant well, that almost made it worse. "You're so inspiring," strangers said unprompted. She smiled politely every time, but inside she wanted to ask, inspiring for what? Existing. She didn't want to be inspiration. She wanted to be competent, respected, normal in a new way. So she built a life with intention. Adaptive sports first. Not because she loved competition, but because she missed the burn, the exhaustion, the proof that effort mattered. Wheelchair basketball left her arms trembling and her lungs screaming, and she loved it more than she expected. Education came next. Public health, policy, systems. She wanted to understand why wounded soldiers fell through cracks that shouldn't exist. She wanted to fix what she could. Her voice carried weight now, not because it was louder, but because people listened. That realization scared her. When interviews came, she chose her words carefully. She refused to glorify pain, refused to frame her story as tragedy or triumph. It was neither. It was consequence. Danny wrote often. Updates, college classes, promotions, ordinary things that felt extraordinary knowing how close he'd come to losing all of it. She never tired of hearing that he was living. That was the point. The documentary team arrived with cameras and patience. They didn't rush her. They waited for her to decide how much to show. Some days she wanted the world to see everything, the scars, the frustration, the raw truth. Other days she shut the door and asked for silence. They respected both. Watching herself on screen later was surreal. A stranger with her face, her voice steadier than she remembered it being. When the footage reached the moment of the attack, she turned away. She didn't need to see it again. What surprised her most was the messages that followed, not praise, not awe. Confessions. Medics who wrote about moments they still questioned. Soldiers who admitted fear they'd never spoken aloud. Families who finally understood what their loved ones carried home. Her story gave them permission. That mattered more than any medal. One email arrived late one night from someone she didn't recognize. The subject line was simple: respect. She almost deleted it. But curiosity won. The sender claimed to have observed the attack from a distance, from the other side. The words were careful, measured, not apologetic, honest. He wrote that he hadn't understood her choice in the moment, that he understood it now. Sarah sat back after reading it, heart pounding for reasons she couldn't immediately name. Anger flared, then confusion, then something quieter. Acknowledgement. She didn't reply, not then, not for a long time. Some truths didn't require response to exist. As years passed, Sarah learned that healing wasn't linear. Some days she felt whole, others fragmented beyond repair. Both were valid. When she spoke to new medics, she didn't sell courage. She sold clarity. You will be afraid, she told them. If you aren't, you're lying to yourself. What matters is knowing who you are before the moment arrives, because once it does, there's no time to decide. They listened, not because of the medal, because she didn't pretend it was easy. One night, alone in her apartment, Sarah rolled to the window and watched city lights blur against the glass. She thought about the person she'd been, running on gravel, laughing at stupid jokes, planning a future that no longer existed. She missed her legs. She missed the simplicity of before. But she didn't miss the person who hadn't yet been tested. Sometimes strength isn't about standing tall. Sometimes it's about staying present. Sometimes it's about carrying the weight of a choice and refusing to let it turn into regret. Sarah closed the curtains, turned off the light, and let the quiet settle. Tomorrow would come, and she would meet it not unchanged, not unscarred, but unbroken in the ways that mattered most. Why did the letter feel heavier than any medical report she had ever received? Sarah let it sit unopened on the kitchen table for nearly an hour. The return address was familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. Official, precise, the kind of envelope that never carried anything small. Outside, the city moved like it always did, traffic humming, distant sirens, people living lives that hadn't been rerouted by a single moment in the desert. She watched a pedestrian struggle with a stubborn umbrella and felt oddly anchored by the ordinariness of it all. Eventually, she opened the letter. The words were respectful, careful, direct. An invitation to speak, not at a ceremony, not for cameras, but at a closed-door review panel, military leadership, medical command, policy advisors, people who decided what was learned and what was quietly filed away. They wanted her perspective. Sarah exhaled slowly. This wasn't about honor. This was about accountability. The night before the panel, sleep refused to come. Her mind replayed details she hadn't revisited in years: radio delays, supply shortages, moments where protocol bent under pressure. She wasn't interested in blame, but she refused to let comfort erase reality. In the room the next day, uniforms mixed with civilian suits. Rank sat beside resume. The air felt tense, not hostile, uncertain. She rolled to the center position without assistance. Small victories still mattered. They asked her to describe the mission. She did, simply, without embellishment, without apology. Then came the harder questions. Could anything have been done differently? Did she feel pressured to act? Would she make the same decision again? That last one lingered. Yes, she said, after a pause that felt like honesty, but I wish the system hadn't required it. Silence followed, not awkward processing. She talked about triage realities, about the cost of hesitation, about how medics were trained to sacrifice, but rarely protected from the consequences of that sacrifice. She spoke about bodies and bandwidth, about exhaustion masquerading as resilience. No one interrupted. When she finished, a general nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, and for once it didn't feel ceremonial. The changes didn't come overnight. They never did, but they came. Gradually, updated protocols, equipment reviews, training shifts that centered sustainability instead of martyrdom. Sarah watched from the outside, contributing where she could, stepping back when the weight threatened to pull her under again. Advocacy was different from combat. It required patience, compromise, a tolerance for slow progress that she didn't naturally possess. Some days she missed the clarity of the battlefield. Their decisions were immediate, consequences obvious. In civilian spaces, outcomes blurred. Her relationship with the military evolved into something complex. She still loved it, still respected it, but she no longer romanticized it. That honesty cost her invitations. It also earned her trust. A nonprofit approached her next. They worked with wounded service members transitioning out of active duty. The work was messy, emotional, underfunded. She said yes. Mentorship became a quiet cornerstone of her life. She met men and women who wore their injuries openly and others who hid them behind humor or anger. Some had visible wounds. Others carried damage no scan could reveal. She listened more than she spoke. One young woman stood out, a former intel analyst, recently discharged, brilliant, guarded. She reminded Sarah uncomfortably of herself. They talked about loss, about guilt, about the fear of becoming a footnote in someone else's war story. "You don't owe anyone a narrative," Sarah told her. "You owe yourself a future." The words surprised her as they left her mouth. They were truer than she realized. Public attention waxed and waned. New stories replaced hers. She was grateful for that. Being remembered had its limits. Yet every so often, something pulled her back. A letter from a family whose son she'd treated years ago. A photo of a wedding she never expected him to reach. A birth announcement. These moments landed quietly, deeply. She kept a box for them, not trophies, proof. The anniversary of the attack passed with less ceremony each year. At first, she marked it with silence, then with reflection, eventually with gratitude. Not for what happened, for what followed. One evening, Danny called. His voice was older now, calmer. He told her he was considering re-enlisting, not out of obligation, out of clarity. "I wouldn't be here without you," he said. Sarah closed her eyes. "Then be here well," she replied, "whatever that looks like." After the call, she sat in the dark, thinking about cycles, about how one moment could echo forward through dozens of lives. She didn't believe in destiny, but she believed in ripples. Her body still reminded her of its limits daily. Pain flared without warning. Fatigue set in faster than it used to. Some mornings she resented the chair. Other mornings she appreciated the freedom it gave her. Acceptance, she learned, wasn't agreement. It was coexistence. Late one night, she found herself rereading the letter that had started it all. The invitation, the request for her voice. She realized something then, something that had taken years to settle. Her value hadn't ended with her mobility. Her service hadn't ended with her uniform. Her strength hadn't ended with that battlefield. It had changed shape. And maybe that was the quiet truth beneath all of it. Strength isn't always loud. Impact isn't always immediate. And sometimes, the bravest thing isn't stepping into danger, but stepping forward afterward, again and again, when the world no longer tells you who you are. Why did the phone keep ringing on the one day she finally felt at peace? Sarah watched it vibrate across the kitchen counter, the screen lighting up with a number she didn't recognize. Once, twice, she let it stop. The quiet returned, fragile but intact. Outside, rain traced slow lines down the window, the kind that softened the edges of the city and made everything feel briefly forgiven. She had learned to treasure days like this, days without obligations, without speeches, without the weight of expectation pressing against her ribs. The phone rang again. She sighed and answered. The voice on the other end was careful, measured, military-trained even when pretending not to be. It belonged to a woman this time, which caught Sarah off guard. "I'm not calling to ask you to relive anything," the voice said. "I'm calling because something is happening and your name keeps coming up." That sentence alone tightened Sarah's shoulders. The situation unfolded slowly over the next few minutes. A forward operating base, a medevac complication, a medic who froze, a soldier who didn't make it. No accusations, no demands. Just questions. Sarah closed her eyes as she listened, not because she wanted to escape, but because she needed to stay present. She recognized the tone immediately. This wasn't about fault, it was about fracture. They wanted her to speak to a group of young medics before the investigation concluded, not to instruct, not to inspire, to tell the truth. She almost said no. Not out of fear, out of exhaustion. Carrying other people's grief had become a habit she never remembered agreeing to. There were days when she wanted to be anonymous again. Just a woman navigating a grocery aisle, not a symbol walking into a room. But something tugged at her, not guilt, responsibility. "I'll do it," she said quietly, once. The base was stateside, clean, organized, controlled in a way the mountains never were. Still, when she rolled into the briefing room, the air felt heavy. Young faces, taut expressions, hands clenched just a little too tightly. They stood when she entered. She gestured for them to sit. "Don't," she said gently. "This isn't that kind of meeting." She told them she wasn't there to judge, that she wasn't there to fix them, that she wouldn't pretend to have answers for things that defied logic. Then she told them about fear. Not cinematic fear, not courage under fire fear, the kind that locks your joints, that scrambles training, that whispers you'll ruin everything if you act. "I felt it too," she said. "I just didn't listen to it." The room was silent, not reverent, engaged. She talked about the weight of responsibility, about how medics lived with outcomes no one else fully carried, about how freezing didn't make you weak, pretending you wouldn't freeze did. One of them finally spoke, a young man, voice shaking. "What if we can't live with the choice we make?" Sarah didn't answer immediately. "Then you learn to live honestly," she said. "You don't hide from it, you don't bury it, and you don't do it alone." When she left, no one applauded. No one thanked her. That felt right. Weeks later, she received a message from the same woman who had called her. The medic had entered counseling voluntarily. The unit had requested additional support training. A life hadn't been saved, but a future might be. That mattered. Not long after, Sarah received an invitation she didn't expect from a veterans retreat in the mountains. Peer-led. No press. No speaking slots. Just time, just space. She hesitated before accepting. The mountains still lived somewhere inside her, sharp and unresolved. But maybe that was exactly why she needed to go. The retreat was quiet in a way that felt intentional. No schedules, no uniforms, just cabins, trails, and people who understood silence. On the second night, around a fire that burned low and steady, stories emerged. Not heroics, not timelines. Truths. A former pilot talked about the day he aborted a mission and the lives that decision haunted him with. A logistics officer spoke about paperwork errors that echoed years later. A medic, older than Sarah, admitted he still counted compressions in his sleep. When it was her turn, Sarah didn't recount the attack. She talked about the morning after, the ceiling, the moment she realized she would never feel her legs again. The fire cracked softly. No one looked away. "I didn't lose myself that day," she said, "but I did have to meet a version of me I didn't recognize." Someone nodded. Healing, she realized, wasn't about moving on. It was about moving with. On the final day, she wheeled down a path overlooking the valley. The air was thin, clean. The view stretched wide and unapologetic. She thought about the woman she'd been before the war, the woman she'd been during it, the woman she was now. None of them canceled the others out. They stacked. Back home, life continued in small, meaningful ways. She taught part-time, mentored quietly, turned down more invitations than she accepted. One afternoon, she found herself back at a hospital, not as a patient, but as a visitor. A wounded soldier lay in a room that smelled like antiseptic and uncertainty. His eyes tracked her chair, then her face. "They said you'd understand," he said. She did. They talked for an hour, about anger, about shame, about the strange relief of surviving when others didn't. She didn't offer platitudes. She offered presence. As she left, the soldier said something that stayed with her. "I thought losing my body meant losing my usefulness." Sarah paused at the door. "No," she said, "it just means you have to redefine it." That night she wrote in a notebook she kept only for herself, not for publication, not for legacy. Just truth. She wrote about the cost of silence, about how strength could calcify if never softened by reflection, about how service didn't end, it transformed. She wrote about hope cautiously, honestly. And when she closed the notebook, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Lightness. Not happiness, not relief. Permission. Sometimes redemption isn't a moment. It's a pattern. A choice repeated quietly. A willingness to stay open when closing off would be easier. Sarah turned out the light and let the rain return. Tomorrow would ask something of her. And she would decide, as she always had, who she was willing to be. Why did the knock at her door feel like the end of something instead of the beginning? Sarah sat still in her chair, hands resting loosely in her lap, listening as the sound echoed through the apartment and faded. She hadn't been expecting anyone. These days, the people who needed her usually called first, announced themselves, prepared her. This knock hadn't. She rolled forward slowly and opened the door. On the other side stood a Marine in dress blues, posture straight, expression respectful but heavy. Behind him, slightly to the side, was another figure, older, broader, wearing no uniform at all. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles pale. For a moment, no one spoke. "I hope this is okay," the Marine said finally. "We didn't want to intrude." Sarah nodded once and opened the door wider. They sat at her small kitchen table. The Marine stayed silent, present but unobtrusive. The older man's eyes kept drifting toward the window, then back to Sarah, as if he wasn't sure where to rest them. "I'm Danny's father," he said at last. The name landed gently, but it carried weight. "I wanted to meet you," he continued. "For years, actually, but I didn't know how." Sarah didn't interrupt. She had learned that some words needed to arrive at their own pace. He talked about the phone call he'd received all those years ago. The one that told him his son was alive, badly hurt, but alive. He talked about the fear that lingered long after recovery. The way gratitude could exist alongside anger and helplessness. "I used to imagine the person who saved him," he admitted. "I pictured someone larger than life." His voice faltered. "And then I realized you're just a person." Sarah met his eyes. "So is he," she said softly. He smiled at that, a tired, grateful smile. When they stood to leave, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Danny wrote this," he said. "He asked me to give it to you." After they were gone, the apartment felt different, charged, quiet in a way that invited reflection instead of loneliness. She didn't open the letter right away. She rolled to the window and watched evening settle over the city. Lights flickered on, one by one, like small acts of faith. Somewhere out there, people were being tested in ways no one would ever fully understand. Eventually, she unfolded the paper. Danny's handwriting was familiar, uneven, earnest. He wrote about his life now, about mistakes, about joy, about the strange pressure of living when someone else had paid such a visible price for it. He wrote that he used to think her sacrifice was something he had to earn. "I finally understand," the letter read. "You didn't give me a debt, you gave me a chance." Sarah closed her eyes. She hadn't realized how badly she needed to hear that. The years that followed didn't bring closure. She no longer believed in that word, but they brought coherence. Her life didn't resolve into a neat arc. It widened instead. Teaching, mentoring, quiet advocacy that rarely made headlines but changed policies one line at a time. She learned when to speak and when to stay silent, when to carry others and when to set the weight down. Some mornings the pain was sharp enough to steal her breath. Other mornings she barely noticed it. Both were honest. Neither defined her. She stopped measuring herself against who she used to be. That comparison had been a losing battle from the start. Instead, she measured herself against something simpler. Was she acting with integrity? Was she present? Was she choosing compassion over comfort? When she was invited to speak one last time at a graduating medic class, she almost declined. She was tired, not physically, existentially. But she went. She looked out at the rows of faces, young, focused, untested. She remembered being one of them, certain in theory, uncertain in truth. She didn't tell them her story in detail. They could find it online if they wanted. Instead, she told them this: "One day something will go wrong, not because you failed, but because reality doesn't always cooperate. In that moment, you'll want to disappear, to be smaller, to not be responsible." She paused. "Don't disappear, stay, even if your hands are shaking, especially then." Afterward, no one rushed the stage. No selfies, no autographs. Just a few quiet nods. That was enough. On the anniversary of the attack, Sarah no longer marked the date with ritual. She spent it doing something ordinary: grocery shopping, reading, sitting in the park. This year she watched children learn how to ride bikes. Some fell, some cried, all got back up eventually. She smiled at the universality of it. Loss didn't make you exceptional. What you did afterward might. That evening, as she returned home, she noticed a package waiting at her door. No return address. Inside was a simple wooden frame containing a photo she had never seen before. It showed a dusty staging area, smoke in the background, chaos frozen mid-motion. At the center of the frame was a medic kneeling over a wounded soldier, hands pressed firmly, body curved protectively. Sorry. She stared at it for a long time. The photo wasn't heroic, it wasn't flattering, it was raw, human, unfinished. She placed it on the shelf, not as a monument, but as a reminder. Not of what she had lost, of what she had chosen. As night settled in, Sarah turned off the lights and sat quietly, listening to the city breathe. She thought about fear, how it never really left, how it simply changed its shape. She thought about courage, how it rarely announced itself. And she thought about dignity, how it didn't demand recognition, how it didn't depend on outcome, how it lived in the space between impulse and action. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It doesn't shout or shine or ask to be remembered. Sometimes dignity simply acts. Once, at great cost, and then lives quietly with the truth of that choice. For the rest of its days.